This is a really beautiful sight. As someone that's been part of high school walkouts and that since I was in high school, which is a little while ago now, I never get sick of seeing people take to the streets fighting for justice and fighting for climate justice in particular. I want to try and gallop through 5 points in 5 minutes, see how I go. And point number one, obviously, is to start with acknowledging whose land we're on. The First Nations people, the Wurundjeri people and the entire Kulin Nations, and the Aboriginal people around this state and around this country, who more than 200 years ago had a social system land on them that turns land into a commodity, that turns human beings into a commodity, that turns everything in the world into a commodity to be bought and sold for a profit. And that social system decided very quickly that it was more profitable to run sheep than to let human beings live on this part of the world, and a genocide ensued. And that social system persists to this day in deciding that it's more profitable to rip coal and gas from the ground than to let Aboriginal people live on their country. And that dispossession continues to this day. And it's an inspiration and an education, should be, for all of us. That despite everything that social system driven by profit has visited on First Nations people, those First Nations people are still here and still fighting for justice. And that should be a reminder to all of us that sometimes the very survival of people depends on resistance, depends on fighting, depends on organising. So I think that's my first point. And that social system, obviously, which gets to my second point, has brought us to a situation that we all know about. We heard before about wildfires in countries that, are unaccustomed to seeing wildfires. We know a bit about that from the bushfire summer of 2019 and 2020. It's not hard to find accounts of firefighters attempting to fight flames 70 metres tall. If you look behind me, that white building, the campus apartments, that's a 15-storey building. That's 60 or 70 metres tall. We're talking about flames that high, in some cases up to 150 metres, twice as high as those buildings. That's not the scariest thing, though. The scariest thing isn't, in my opinion, the 33 people who died from the flames that year, the 400 people who died from the smoke that year, the maybe 1 billion animals who died from the fire and the smoke and the after effects in that year. Maybe the scariest thing isn't that 7% of the huge landmass of New South Wales, an area the size is bigger than many European countries, burned in that year. Maybe that's not the scariest thing. The scariest thing for me is that the Bureau of Meteorology and the CSIRO say that summer, the summer of 2019-2020, will be an average summer with 1.5 degrees of global warming. All those flames, all that death, all that ash, they are saying will be our average summer with 1.5 degrees of global warming. And as we know, Labor is currently looking at 1.5 degrees out its rear vision mirror as it zooms past on its planet incinerating 43% target. Which brings me to my third point, which is the new Labor government. And it's hard, I think, I find it hard to get a concept of the scale of the fossil fuel projects that Labor is prepared to approve. I went to Latrobe Valley last week, one of my occasional visits, and as you enter the town of Morwell, you can see on your right-hand side a massive pit, a massive former coal mine that is 100 metres deep and that is the size of the CBD of Melbourne, all the way from Docklands through to the MCG. That is the former coal mine, the open-cut coal mine that for 60 years fed coal to Australia's highest emitting power station, most emissions-intensive power station, the Hazelwood Power Station. And the best estimates I've seen is that all of that coal, 100 metres deep, size of the CBD, all of that coal fed into that power station, sent up those smokestacks. The CO2 amounted to 400 million tonnes of CO2, a huge contribution to global heating. 400 million tonnes. The Scarborough project alone in West Australia will release 1.4 billion tonnes of CO2. 3.5 times that enormous pit out in the Latrobe Valley, and that's not the biggest pit out there. The Beetaloo project, similar sort of size, and that's just the first of the massive gas fracking projects that Labor is prepared to endorse in the Northern Territory. Add Narrabri, add Beach Energy down at the Otway Basin. Thank you, Daniel Andrews, for your contribution to cooking the planet. That tells us, I think, everything that we need to know about where we're headed under Labor. Which gets me to my fourth point. What do we have going for us? What we have going for us is actually quite a bit. What we have going for us, in my opinion, is the huge majority of humanity that do not make billion-dollar profits from cooking the planet. What we have going for us is many people in the Latrobe Valley. There's this stereotype that, oh, you know, the coal regions, you know, it's all of these coal-loving regional blue-collar workers, that's the people to blame. No, it's bullshit. It's a lie and it's an insult to say that. You go to the Latrobe Valley and just like any other part of the country or the world, there's a huge argument taking place, and there are people in that community and in those power stations making arguments about we need to get the hell out of fossil fuels as soon as possible. That's something that we have going for us. What we have going for us is mass movements like what the climate strikers showed us in 2019 is possible around the world. Some of the biggest protests that have happened in this town for a hell of a long time. We've got that going for us. We've got civil disobedience going for us. Whether it's XR, whether it's Blockade IMARC, whether it's a Blockade Australia, we're going to need a shit ton more of that. We have our own ingenuity, we have the truth going for us, but the truth is never going to be enough. We need organisation to turn all of that into a mass movement. And one thing that we also need, and this is what I'll finish on, if that movement is going to succeed, is radical politics. And that's something that I think a lot of people here from different perspectives share in. And that's something that Victorian Socialists is very much into building in the few months ahead in the election campaign. Yes, we'll be talking about reversing privatisations. Yes, we'll be talking about zero emissions electricity grids by 2030 and a zero carbon economy by 2035, because I think that's the only thing that we can be talking about if we're serious about stopping the cooking of the planet. Yes, we'll be talking about all of that, but we'll also be talking about a vision of a society that is not a social system that turns everything into a commodity for profit to be bought and sold even as the bodies pile high. We'll be talking about a vision of a society which is founded on solidarity and cooperation, which comes out of the struggles of today, but doesn't rely on billion-dollar corporations running our energy system and running the world, and says to those billion-dollar corporations, do not pass go. Do not collect $11.7 billion from the federal government this year. Your time is up. You've done it. Get out of the way. You can take your 43% greenwashing target. You can take your coal and gas. You can go to hell with them, because we're taking our world back. Let's do it. Thank you.